It's a great honor. Thank you to the Daughters of 1812, a war that does not hold the place in the broader national imagination that it should, for it was the conflict that ratified the existence of the nation. Before 1815, it was a tenuous, close-run thing, as Wellington said of Waterloo. And partly because of what Andrew Jackson did and the Tennessee Volunteers did and the diplomatic work of John Quincy Adams, a name not often spoken here, but we should do so in the spirit of ecumenical. I think Reverend Moran would appreciate that. I'm not going to mention Henry Clay because that would just upset the general too much. Because of that work, the country survived and thrived, and here we are. So the dancing had just ended when word arrived. It was the second week of December, 1814, and amid a New Orleans social gathering offering the briefest of respites from the war with Great Britain, a report reached General Andrew Jackson that fighting was about to break out. Understandably, a guest recalled, there was the greatest alarm. Fear broke out and panic ensued. Until, that is, Andrew Jackson stepped in. Described as elegant, persuading, and convincing, the Major General from Tennessee soothed the crowd, bringing order to chaos. It was vintage Jackson, who had taught himself the most elemental art of command, the capacity to reassure amidst anxiety. Such was the man on whose land we stand at this distant hour, a flawed hero who in many ways represents the best and the worst in the American character. We gathered to commemorate the victory at New Orleans, and what a victory it was. On the 8th of January, 1815, it was a wintertime Sunday. The British lost nearly 300 men, with another 1,200 wounded and hundreds more taken prisoner or going missing. 300 died. By contrast, only 13 Americans died, with 39 suffering wounds. 300 to 13. It was a wondrous victory. As the cannon smoke began to lift that morning and surviving British soldiers who had hidden beneath their fallen comrades' redcoats rose from the heaps of corpses, Jackson remarked, "I never had so grand and awful an idea of the resurrection as on that day." The triumph propelled Jackson to national and international glory. In the popular mind, he became the second George Washington, the commander who won the War of 1812, the victory that, as we noted, ratified the Revolution. I'd like to take just a moment this morning to talk about how the complexities of Jackson mirror our own complexities, and thus those of the country's. Because there is a little Jacksonianism in all of us, or at least in most of us. We have to understand the man buried here in order to understand ourselves. Soldier, brawler, duelist, lover, politician. Andrew Jackson was the first American president to be the target of assassination and the only one to attack his own assassin. Tough and wily, passionate and canny, he rewrote the script of American life to give the people a larger voice in its affairs. As Harry Truman once said, Andrew Jackson looked after the little guy who had no pull, and that's what a president is supposed to do. Say that again. Andrew Jackson looked after the little guy who had no pull, and that's what a president is supposed to do.
Amen.
And it is. At least it's what our greatest presidents have always done. Urged us to open our arms wider, to expand the definition of what it means to be an American, to include the newcomer and the wanderer rather than exclude. Let's be very clear with one another. Andrew Jackson was actively complicit in the twin tragedies of American life. He was an unapologetic defender of slavery and the driving force behind the removal of Native Americans. We live on land that once rightfully belonged to others. Not far from this very spot, or the Hermitage slave quarters, a rebuke to the generations of white Americans who limited crusades for life and liberty to their own kind. Yet, the great often teach not only by their finest hours, but by their dimmest. The tragedy of Andrew Jackson's life is that a man dedicated to freedom failed to see liberty as a universal, not a particular gift. The triumph of his life is that, beginning at New Orleans, he held together a country whose experiment in liberty ultimately allowed for the ongoing extension of its protections and promises. I believe the moral utility of history lies in the capacity of the present, in our capacity, yours and mine, to look the past in the eye, not to look up at it adoringly or down on it self-righteously. We learn more from people when we meet them in the eye than when we judge them beforehand or when we celebrate them mindlessly. By looking our long ago leaders in the eye, we can see things about them and about ourselves that should ideally inspire and challenge us, not to wag our fingers at posterity, but to undertake the urgent work of moral and social reform in our own time, if only so that when the future looks us in the eye, they will see men and women who took action rather than taking a pass. The challenges Jackson faced resonate in our own age. He believed the financial sector of the American economy was bad for the health of the nation, and so he destroyed the Bank of the United States. He wanted the country to be respected globally, and so he was quick to send forces to confront pirates, and he engaged in epic diplomatic battle against France, some things never change, when it refused to pay money it owed the United States. He thought the American Union sacred, and so he threatened civil war to put down radicals in South Carolina. His enemies, as we know, were ferocious. A New England teacher once asked her class who had killed Abel. A little boy raised his hand and said General Jackson. When Harvard voted to give the 7th president an honorary degree in 1833, a Massachusetts newspaper wrote that he deserved an ASS rather than an LLD. The slurs and slanders against Rachel Donaldson Jackson were worse. She was a noble woman whose contribution to American history is far too little appreciated. Let's be honest, any woman who could create a safe, loving haven for the restless and relentless Andrew Jackson would be remarkable enough. That Rachel Jackson did so while suffering the slings and arrows of political hate makes her achievement all the more remarkable. Every president since Old Hickory has worked in the shadow of and stood on the shoulders of Andrew Jackson, and his presidency offers very interesting and important lessons. I want to quickly talk about two that come to mind at this moment in our history. First is that Jackson never allowed himself to become a prisoner of Washington, D.C. The White House can be lonely, isolating, and distorting. Presidents only hear good news from subordinates and criticism from foes. Jackson understood this and often received old friends and members of the public as well as his staff. He traveled every year to the shore in Virginia and back here to the Hermitage, staying at hotels and public houses along the way. This way, he could hear what real people were saying, a crucial element in the art of democratic leadership. The second lesson, I think, from Jackson's presidency is one that I think we could all use, and I suspect Reverend Moran would appreciate this too. He turned his vices into virtues. He was, to say the least, a hot-tempered man. He carried 2 bullets in his body from duels and gunfights over matters of honor, and threatened to hang his own vice president. Those who think that Washington is only now in conflict, I refer you to that. He did once say that his only 2 regrets in public life were that he had not shot Henry Clay and hung John C. Calhoun. I know Congressman Cooper thinks it's tough, but, you know. But he was wise enough to know how to make this possible disadvantage his temper and advantage. Once, during a crisis over the Bank of the United States, a delegation came to Jackson wanting relief. And he foamed and pounded the table and raged and said, "Why are you here? I don't want to see you." They ran out, terrified, and closer to his position because they thought he was going to tear him apart. The moment the door shut, Jackson turned to an aide and said, "Didn't I manage them well?" More broadly, Jackson's faults are the country's. And whenever we take the selfish rather than the unselfish route, or close a door rather than opening it, we're repeating the mistakes of the past. But when we trust in others, when we fight for everyone to have a fair shot at making it in this country, when we care for the helpless and stand by our friends, then we are working in the best part of the tradition of Andrew Jackson. So let us end where we began, at the Battle of New Orleans nearly 2 centuries ago. When the War of 1812 began, Jackson called for Tennessee volunteers with these words: "Who are we? And for what are we going to fight? Are we the titled slaves of George III, the military conscripts of Napoleon the Great, or the sons of America, the citizens of the only republic now existing in the world, and the only people on earth who possess rights, liberties, and property they dare call their own? Then as now, we, you and I, are the sons and daughters of America, of a republic worth fighting for on battlefields of all kinds, in the unending war to perfect the Union that Andrew and Rachel Jackson loved so." Thank you.